Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sahithya. I'm a research intern at Swabhimaan, which is an initiative under the Center for New Economic Studies based on exploring the intersectionality of gender across the discourse of development studies, social policy, and entrepreneurship. So today, our conversation is focused on our upcoming volume, which is Dalit Women at the Nexus of Caste and Gender Discriminations, and its first issue, the representation of Dalit women in different kinds of literature. For this purpose, today we have with us Ms. Kamna Singh, who is pursuing a PhD at Delhi University on the literature. First of all, welcome, ma'am. If you would like to tell us a little bit about the work that you've been engaged with, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Savya, for this invitation. I'm glad to be a part of this. I am doing my PhD in English literature from Delhi University, and my research area is how caste operates in different spaces. I started by working on caste in urban spaces for my MPhil from the vantage point of a Dalit woman, for which I worked on the first two autobiographies written by Dalit women in English language. And for my PhD, I'm expanding on that project. I am also bringing in the angle of how do global movements impact the anti-caste movement, both in the United States of America and in India. So that's broadly my research area. And apart from that, I'm also engaged in doing sensitivity reading, which is a specialized form of editing texts and journalistic stories for accurate representation. And I also model a little bit, which is again to question the ideas of beauty and how they, like the ideas of beauty that we have in India, are very Brahminical in nature, how it goes back to its representation in ancient texts, which are mostly like written by caste privileged people. So by using my platform like for modeling, and I'm trying to re-theorize aesthetics and question the already established aesthetics that we appreciate in the form of beauty in fashion and in general, like, you know, our society. So that's a little bit about what I do. And I'm really glad that you gave me this opportunity to talk to you about my research. And yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you for that. The beauty point of view, I'm really interested in because I've written some papers in college only about that, and it's so strange how even like centuries later, even in the contemporary world, this is still happening with, like, you can see with ads, Fair and Lovely and all that. Now that it's changed to Glow and Lovely, but still propagating the same kind of Brahminical, like you said, beauty features.
Yeah.
So So on that note, I would like to start with the first question. So what do you think are some of the ways in which Dalit female literature can be used to promote social change? And could you elaborate on how these writers use language to counteract historical oppression?
Okay. So first of all, like Dalit women writing, like it's revolutionary at two level, not just one. Because I mean, this is the like corpus of writing. This is like the body of writing that has been excluded from the broad Indian writings that we like understand. Like, you know, basically Indian literature has excluded Dalit experience as a whole. It's never really featured like authors from the communities who are talking about their own experiences. And after that, like in 19th century, two movements emerged. One was like feminist movement, the other one was Dalit movement. Like they have their roots in 19th century, the anti-reform movement, which was again led by mostly caste privileged people. But there were also voices like Jyotiba Phule who were articulating the caste standpoint. But again, how these two strands fully developed into movements but were never able to actually incorporate the experience of a Dalit woman. Even the literature that we have today, it does not include the experience of Dalit women, both in like feminist literature of India, which is again, they largely focus on gender as a very isolated category. And whenever there have been attempts to like question that gender cannot be studied in isolation, a lot of caste privileged feminists have posed their objections to that and used terms like how it can like how introducing new categories in terms of caste, class, gender, caste, class, region, they are again tools for governmentalizing the category of gender. And in terms of like when we talk about Dalit literature, like again, in 1970s, Dalit Panthers emerged as a movement, and people started writing about their like experiences of untouchability, and in the forms of essays, like literary stories, and mostly polemic, like there were polemic forms of writings as well. But in all these writings, what was missing was the standpoint of a Dalit woman. They like either treated them like as like, I mean, every time you will find a mention of a Dalit woman in a literary text, they will be in like in prescribed roles of mothers, sisters, and never as individuals. And this was countered by authors like Urmila Pawar when they like came up with writings like "We also made history." The term also needs to be emphasized here. Why did they have to think about something like this? We also made history. And interestingly, this research project was rejected by Mumbai University when Urmila Pawar actually pitched this as a for her PhD research. So, given all of this context, I think Dalit women's writings is like doubly revolutionary, as it is just not countering the silence imposed on Dalit women because of their caste identity, but also because of their gender. They're posing questions to both the movements that where are we? Like, how do you see us? Why are both of you speaking on our behalf? Why can't we speak for ourselves? So they have built their own stage. Rather, they have not asked either of these movements or the larger Indian movement at like broadly, but they have focused on building their own stage, which again had its seeds in 19th century when Jyotiba Phule's wife Savitribai Phule was teaching an 11-year-old like Muktabai Salve, like she was an 11-year-old girl who was writing that essay on caste and gender, how they impact her life. The title of that essay is The Grief of Monks and Mahar in English, and in Marathi, Mang Mritya Visai. I'm not proficient in Marathi, so unfortunately I don't know the accurate like pronunciation of it, but it translates to The Grief of Monks and Mahar. But when we read about the feminist movement today, like we don't find that we don't find anything about them. It's like I think it's much later that we have started actually looking. So when people like me, we look for like our representation, when we look for our experience in literature, we have to do actual research to actually just find that little place, that little representation. Because again, like you don't find your experiences in feminist movement, you neither find your experiences in the Dalit movement, Dalit literary movement. So what do? You then do a bit of more research, but then you come across Dalit women's literature, and then you're confused that which category should you like actually identify with. And that is where like Dalit feminist standpoint comes in. And Dalit feminist standpoint, again, like it introduces the idea of intersectionality and how you cannot look gender in isolation or at the experience of caste in isolation. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Like you said, Dalit women were not treated as their own, we can say, sort of protagonists. They were treated as sideline characters. And so, like Urmila Parwar's work, and I also came across Sukir Tharani's work, and her poem called The Infant Language. She talks about forging a language that has not been spoken before, that explains the kind of like lived experiences of Dalit people, like what they faced and what they continue to face, and how it's important for them to be the main agents in that in their accounts, in their retellings of their stories. So like it helps us I think hold up it essentially. It's so open and in a way that allows us to like hold up a mirror to society and like recheck the boundaries that have been set in place. So I think obviously storytelling builds this sort of social consciousness, and but their individual efforts are often strengthened by the support and solidarity of a strong community. So could you elaborate on how Dalit female writers have built communities and networks to support each other?
Yeah, I mean, Dalit women, this is also a little bit of my own research wherein I'm working on international movements and their impact on Dalit women's movement. So I specifically worked on Yashika Dutt's text and Sujata Gidla's text. Yashika Dutt's text is titled Coming Out as Dalit, whereas Sujata Gidla's text is Ant Among Elephants, An Untouchable Family and the Making of Modern India. So in both these texts, what was common for me was how they acquired their language. So both these women, they interacted with a lot of Black people, and this is what like they even write about in their texts. So I think they built their solidarities by shared experiences, and which is something that you don't find very easily in India, because I have interacted with activists from like queer spaces, from feminist spaces, from communist spaces. But what the problem in all these spaces is that these movements are all led by caste privileged people. These movements have come through the agencies of caste privileged people and who deny the presence of caste. Caste as a discourse is struggling to gain legitimacy. It's still in very primal like stages where it like a lot of people don't even want to acknowledge that caste actually like plays a role in our lives, and like for them it's just restricted to personal affairs, for example personal habits, like and who are you going to marry, but then nobody really talks about how like there are larger implications. So this is why it becomes very difficult to establish solidarities within India in cross movement, like within like movements. But at the same time, with like as Yashika, that I think in the introduction of her like book only, she talks about how when she went to Columbia University and interacted with a lot of other people who were again Black people, Hispanics, and when she talked about her own experience there, so she like by interacting with those people, she realized what was happening to her was oppression. And do you realize how like that did not happen for her entire life? Like she just kept her caste identity hidden and all the shame that came with it hidden. And that got a language, like once she moved out of India and interacted with people who were not like a part of her immediate Indian milieu. So this is why like Dalit women become really isolated, and like it's very difficult for you to find solidarities or shared spaces where you can actually share your experience, because caste as an experience is not understood, and like a lot of people don't even want to understand it. So like in terms of solidarity, I think we are still like there's a long way for that. There's a very long way for that. Like I think in say like 10-20 more years, as caste like gains more legitimacy as a discourse, because you will find like representation of feminist movement, feminist articulation, queer movement, queer articulation in the mainstream popular cinema, popular uh, novels, books and everything. You will find all of this there. But the moment you talk about caste, the kind of representation that is out there in cinema, which is widely consumed, it delegitimizes that movement. It categorizes Dalits as either opportunists or as helpless victims. There is nothing in between. So like it gets systematically constructed, and therefore like you can't find or establish solidarities. So I think I don't think we have solidarities. We have a long way to go about that.
Thank you. It's interesting how when Yashika Dutt moved out of this space, moved out of India and interacted with outside with people in the US, she was able to finally come out and reclaim her identity. And I think, like you talked about cinema, I think Dalit women also face a lot of issues when they're not appreciated or appropriately credited. Like Made in Heaven had, like, the story was based on Yashika Dutt, but they didn't credit her that it was their story. So I think that puts a lot of pressure on Dalit women as well. So, and despite this kind of networking, these communities often face challenges because of censorship or attempts to silence them. So, could you share some insights into how Dalit female writers have been censored or silenced, and what are some of the resources available to support Dalit female writers that allow them to keep creating despite these restraints?
Yeah, I mean, Dalit women have been creating for a very long time. And like here, like the first name that comes to my mind here is of Baby Kamle. Baby Kamle used to write while she used to sell vegetables. It was like a personal diary that she published like 30 years later in 1986. She's been like, all of us have been writing. Dalit women write all the time. There is some kind of an expression all the time. But then like the politics of publication, who is going to publish it? And plus, most of the Dalit writings, early Dalit writings, are in regional languages. Who is going to publish it? So, because in publication spaces, again, you will have caste privileged people who will look down upon these writings, citing that they do not, like, they do not really adhere to the aesthetic standards, that they are very differently written. And sometimes, like, they will downright question like its credibility, that this is all emotional, why are you writing this is a polemic, this doesn't have any artistic value. Given all of this, how do you actually find spaces that are going to publish your writings? So I don't agree with the idea that Dalit women have not been writing. It's like, who has actually made an attempt to dig it and like find more and more narratives? You go and talk to people, they will have their own narratives all the time. My grandmother, like, I mean, she was 80 years old, and like, I mean, this is how she's always looked the same. When I was 14, she looked the same. When I was 24, she looked the same. She sadly passed away in 2015, but I remember she used to tell me like a lot of stories and a lot of things that had a lot of element of magic, a lot of element of like some, I mean, now like today when I think about it, it's a lot like the Jataka tales that we have. Like, I mean, our communities have our own stories, our own culture, our own deities, but then they do not get legitimacy in the mainstream discourse, because I had never listened to those stories anywhere else. I had access to Doordarshan TV. My parents were very strict, so no cable for me. So I grew up watching a lot of Rabindranath Tagore. I grew up watching a lot of uh, Hari Shankar Parsai, and a lot of like women writers, which were again Charitrahin comes to my mind, and Neem Kapoor, and all these TV shows that used to come. So it like you never find those characters like that are relatable to you. And I remember I watched Sangati this one time. Sangati is by I'm forgetting this name, like a very famous Satyajit Ray. Sangati, the Dalit character is literally named Dukhi there. And like we saw what happened in Lagan, like the person is literally named Kachra. These are the representations that we grow up watching. And like when we try to like question it, when people try to write about these things, publishing houses don't publish it. Like mainstream like production houses don't give space. I mean, it's today that Neeraj Ghewan's representation, like Neeraj Ghewan's story, like what his like the experience of being a Dalit queer person, the experience of being a Dalit woman, the experience of being a Dalit man. These are experiences that have now like in 2021 2022, I think it's like now that they have actually become a part of quote unquote mainstream. Prior to this we had representations quote unquote, which are not really representations, like Article 15, The White Tiger, and Serious Men. And all these three movies are made by caste privileged people. And whenever you talk to them about representation, did they have somebody from the community in their team? Did they hire any sensitivity like somebody who could watch these films for sensitivity? There were none. And you look at the representation. Article 15, you will see like Dalit women with crouched back, okay, with silent, crouched back, dark skinned, with kajal and everything, very stereotypical representations. And how voyeuristic like that movie was in showing like Dalit girls hanging on tree. I mean, for me, it was personally very triggering to actually see that. And secondly, to actually kill a character that is alive. They based a character like on Chandrasekhar Azad, which is like a prominent Dalit politician and an activist. And they killed him in the movie. The person who is alive, they kill him in the movie. And secondly, in Serious Men, again, they show like the con side of being a Dalit person, that you're not inherently talented, you can never be inherently intelligent. But then, yeah, like this is what Dalit people do. They con themselves into spaces, and then ultimately they are only going to be redeemed by a Brahmin person, by a caste privileged person. So this is the plot of that. And again, the third, I don't remember which, Serious Men, Article 15, and The White Tiger. Again, the same narrative, like that, you have to be a quote unquote white tiger among a community that is otherwise not quote unquote intelligent, smart, or like you have to be a white tiger among them. This is how like the narrative starts of White Tiger. And if you even read the book, it's a first person narrative. A caste privileged person representing a Dalit community. And that too, like in a way wherein they are saying that, uh, such people only are born once in like a century or something like that, that otherwise the Dalit community, or like the communities that we are talking about, they're otherwise like negligible. They don't have those abilities. They're not smart, they're not intelligent, they are not good looking, and anything. All these ideas are just commonly out there. And then like The White Tiger, the little title of that movie, that once in a lifetime you find somebody like that who cons their way to success. So this establishes the same narrative that either Dalits are helpless victims, as you see in Article 50, or they are like, cons, like The White Tiger, Serious Men. This is just how it is. And even in Lagan, it's Kachra, like person who's literally named Kachra. So, I mean, given all of this, it's very difficult to like, I mean, counter these narratives that are created by caste privileged people and are also reproduced by people who have power. Why do you think they will give Dalit people a power to write back to them, answer back to them? So like in given all of this, there are now like, I mean, there are several small scale publishing houses by Dalits as well, Dalits only, which are not that big scale, like people who have personally invested their own personal resources. So there's a publishing house in Shahadra that publishes Dalit writers in Hindi. And then there is Panthers Paw Publication. That's again like a very recent like publishing house by Yogesh Maitreya. So it's only now that people have started establishing their own public publishing houses, because mainstream publishing houses that are again mostly dominated by caste privileged people won't just publish them. So that's a long answer to your question though, but I hope I was able to answer that.
No, thank you so much for that. That was extremely insightful because I remember watching Article 15 long time back, and like you said, the imagery of those two girls hanging, that was extremely disturbing. And I actually didn't focus much on the other aspect of it. I am going to watch it again. And like you said, these narratives are so inbuilt, like when actual people want to go and publish about their own retellings, then certain publishers or publishing houses might have prejudices, or they might just not want to publish stories that are challenging like the dominant perspective or the Brahminical ideals, I think. So yeah, obviously this sort of censorship is extremely harmful to their accounts of their stories. But when we come to the body of their work, how do you think Dalit female writers have employed mythology in their writing to highlight cultural narratives that imbibe casteist notions?
Yeah, I think this was one question that I thought a lot about. And I think this was also mentioned in the concept note about Meena Kandasamy. So first of all, here we will have to understand it a bit like more, because again, when we talk about the idea Dalit, so the term Dalit specifically refers to scheduled caste communities. And the common experience that all these communities share is that of untouchability. Whereas Meena Kandasamy like is an anti-caste writer, but I wouldn't call her a Dalit writer, because again she is a Bahujan woman. So here we will have to again understand like what falls in the caste system and what doesn't fall in the caste system. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has written 2 books, Who Are the Shudras and then Who Are the Untouchables, How They Became Untouchables. These are 2 separate books. Shudras and untouchables are different. So while you can be an anti-caste writer, for you to be a Dalit writer, you have to be a Dalit person. So this is again informed by my understanding of what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar writes about in the 2 books. So I have come across mythology, a very different alternate kind of mythology in writings of Baby Kamle, wherein they refer to their own local deities that you wouldn't find a mention of any mainstream narratives about religion, about their own personal experiences. I mean, the personal habits, personal cultures are very different for the Dalit community, and that they don't really find a way in like mainstream writings. And as for like Meena Kandasamy, I think there's a poetry book that she's written about, wherein she talks about Sita, Draupadi. She invokes those ideas that are again very Brahminical gods and goddesses. So I personally, I think that I don't really, it's kind of, uh, it's kind of a very Brahminical way of looking at uh, these ideals and then subverting them to make them feminist icons. But then when you look at it from the perspective of caste, you see that to be Brahminical in the first place. Why would you want to actually celebrate certain ideals, certain deities that the Brahminical Hinduism sort of imposes on you? It's like celebrating feminist Rakhi. It's like celebrating feminist Karwa Chauth. So it's a bit confusing for my brain. I'm yet to fully come up with an understanding of this, but this doesn't quite sit well. And for if you talk about Dalit women's autobiographies, particularly the ones that I have read, I haven't yet found a Dalit woman writer who has idealized any kind of Hindu mythology and tried to subvert it into another way. They have either converted to Buddhism or they have become Ambedkarite. When you become Ambedkarite, when you start following Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the first thing is to renounce Hinduism, and that is to come out of the Hindu fold. So that is also mentioned in Annihilation of Caste as the solution, that you will have to leave Hinduism as a whole in order to in order to become who you are, in order to claim the I am. Otherwise, you will always be the other, you will always be the untouchable. So this is why I don't see a lot of Dalit women writers employing Brahminical mythology to do anything with it. I haven't found any, in my limited reading of it, I haven't found anybody who's actually spoken about it the way Meena Kandasamy has.
Thank you for that. I also came across Sukita Rani's poem Aruvan. So in that, like you said, Meena Kandasamy talks about Draupadi, who is already a Brahminical figure. But in Aruvan, she talks about, she retells Mahabharat from the perspective of the forest people, who are traditionally depicted as wild and barbaric. So she, in that movie, she basically challenges the Brahminical narrative that basically devalues and demonizes Dalit communities. So do you think that would be a more relevant kind of perspective?
Yeah, I think that is going to be a more relevant perspective. That's also something that Sujata Gidla also touches upon in her text. Again, the narrative of colonization, and then you depicting certain people as demons. For example, we celebrate Holi, and it's if you go back into it, it's if you go back into what signifies, what is the significance of Holi? It's basically the burning of Holika, again, which is a celebrated woman in the Dalit Bahujan culture. So that kind of what you are talking about, it's that kind of an understanding that's out there, but then not outright, what again, usage of Sita, usage of Draupadi, and then trying to feminist, present them as feminist characters. Because again, the intersection of caste and gender is very, very complicated. Caste has a lot of cultural connotations which rejects Brahmanism as a whole. So, as you spoke about, what it like whenever you talk about mythology from that perspective, it's again that perspective of questioning that other person. I think Jyotiba Phule also has written a book, Gulamgiri, wherein he also talks about the battle between devas and asuras, and how we always see asuras as people who are demons who need to be annihilated by the gods. The winning of good over evil is the narrative, and who is the evil? Asuras. And if we go back into researching how these myths are constructed and what is the identities of the people who are getting annihilated, and what are these myths based on, these myths are based on conquering certain tribes and then demonizing them. So that aspect definitely is there in literature, but then it's not from that perspective. I mean, when I read this question, what came to my mind was Meena Kandaswamy's text, because that was also there in the concept note. So I could think about it from that perspective primarily.
So we were talking about the mythological inspirations, and you rightfully mentioned the adoption of Brahmanical structures in Meena Kandaswamy's work, for example. But when we come to the contemporary backdrop, so there is still a lot of challenges and opportunities that Dalit female writers face. So what do you think are these challenges that they face in the contemporary literary landscape?
Again, appropriation, not giving people adequate credit, and I think appropriation, legitimacy, and not giving people appropriate credit. And I mean, I think these are three major challenges. Apart from these, certain, when you have been generationally in power, you will also have to step back if you really want the narrative of, say, feminism to be inclusive. You will have to, it's going to be your responsibility as somebody who is in a position of power to offer those opportunities and spaces to people who don't have enough power and opportunities. I think I draw this idea from both my experiences and this writer that I follow for both understanding and developing my teaching pedagogy and the way I understand my own experience. That is a Black woman writer called Bell Hooks. So that it has, opened my eyes to this idea that why all these structures are there in the first place, why there is so much unhappiness, inequality, and hierarchy in place. Because fundamentally, we as a society, we lack love. And by that, what I mean is that you don't have love for a fellow human being. And when I use the term love, I don't use it in a very narrow term. I use it in a way that, I have come about this understanding of this idea of love, wherein it's a tool that makes you see the other person. And when you fully see the other person, you empathize with them. So the absence of love in our society drives certain people away from opportunities and power that is rightfully theirs, whereas it also concentrates that power in one community or one section of the society in abundance. So for somebody to actually aspire to create a society that is just, that has mutual respect for people, that has happiness, that has love, there will have to be power sharing. So people who are in position of powers, people who do consider themselves as leaders of, say, feminist movement, of communist movement, of anti-caste movement, of anything, any movement, any kind of, if you have any kind of power, you will have to share, you will have to encourage more and more people to come and claim the space that is rightfully yours, and to pass the mic instead of speaking on somebody's behalf. So because nobody is silent, I in my undergrad I read this theorist who like espoused this idea that, you know, the subaltern cannot speak. But that's not true. Everybody is speaking. It's on us who we choose to hear. So by changing the way we think about like power, by changing the way we think about people, we can radically transform like and bring more and more perspectives to decanonize the canon that we have, and to make it more inclusive, both in terms of caste and disability. Like these are two areas that I work with, so I can comment on these from that perspective. That these, because again, persons with disabilities from the community, from the Dalit community, they don't find any representation. It's like you have some like there are so many barriers in our society. Like when we talk about accessibility, it's just not limited to the physical barriers. There are cultural barriers, there are social barriers that are posed to like a Dalit person who is also a woman, and say who is also a person with disability. So they will have multiple challenges, social barriers, cultural barriers, and economic barriers. So what we can do to actually make these spaces to like encourage more and more Dalit women's voices is to like to leave our spaces sometimes, and to share power like sometimes, and to listen to that voice that is a little like low and that doesn't speak very, like, you know, that is just silent, like in a room filled with people. By passing that mic to that person, probably we can do a bit.
Thank you so much. I think my next question also you have answered previously, but if you'd like to elaborate on what your understanding of a need for a Dalit feminist literary standpoint is, like you've already spoken about it, but if you'd like to say anything more.
Yeah, I mean, all the essays, all the theories, when I was like doing my undergrad and masters, I did not come across a lot of writings by Dalit women. And the literature that resonated with me was by J. Kalyan Rao, Untouchable Spring, Toni Morrison's writings, Beloved, Sula, and Alice Walker's The Color Purple. This was my initiation into trying to understand like my own experience, and like the need for it. And I started working on autobiographies because I was trying to find out my own experience of struggling through like higher education, through navigating through spaces that like sort of make you feel that you are a trespasser there. So I realized that there is a need for like a book that talks about gender from the perspective that I understand. And I think during my undergrad, I also attended a seminar by a prominent feminist activist and writer called Kamna Singh. She like late Kamna Singh. So it was a fun session, but at the same time, at the end of it, I had one question for her. I am trying to understand my experience, and I have two buckets. One is gender, one is caste. Which one should I pick? I'm very confused. So even she couldn't answer my question. She asked me, she said that, you know, patriarchy operates in all communities. So probably like, you know, that is how you should be able to understand it. But then I started navigating through the feminist movement, feminist writings and other things. And I realized I came at loggerheads with like feminist writers who are also caste privileged, them like just delegitimizing the concerns of Dalit women. And I then like realized that even feminist movement is not really giving me my answers. So that is when I started exploring more and more of anti-caste writings. And then I had already read feminist literature, and then I came across Urmila Pawar's book. That is when I started to understand how these two movements are not, these two like bodies of writings are not addressing the concerns of Dalit women at all. And this is where like I started reading about Sharmila Rege's like the Dalit standpoint. And even after that, Sunaina Arya has like done a really good book on it. It's called Dalit Feminist Theory, wherein she has picked all the conceptualization of gender like by academics like Nivedita Menon and other like prominent feminist authors who are again like from a caste privilege position, and how like by missing out on caste they are actually creating like a gap that is not going to like culminate into the goal that they are trying to like achieve of a gender just society by neglecting one section. So like in one of the sections, Sunaina Arya talks about how during the Mandal Commission protests, uh, prominent colleges, feminist legacy colleges like Lady Shri Ram College, Miranda House, they were protesting for like rolling back of reservation policy that was for the OBC communities in 1990s. And the placards that they were holding said that who will marry us now? Because again, the assumption was that like now all the government jobs, the prestigious government jobs and all these will be given to category people because of reservation. Now who are we going to marry? So when I read this, the first question that came to my mind was that why can you not marry outside your communities? And secondly, like reservation is proportionate to like a person's population, and it's not like a free pass. So I was like, I mean, this is where feminist movement comes to like in loggerheads with the anti-caste movement and particularly Dalit women's movement. So this is where I realized that understanding of like a Dalit woman's experience is not going to come from any of these movements. Dalit women will have to step into the puddle and like create their own stage like they have been, and conceptualize their own ideas of what it means to live as a Dalit woman. So like people who do write on caste, a lot of caste privileged people do write on caste. There are authors like Anupama Rao, there are authors who are caste privileged, yet they have been able to conceptualize caste and the nuances of it, Sharmila Rege being one too. And very like nice analysis, very like important analysis, very important contributions. But at the same time, I also feel that more and more Dalit women should be encouraged to write their own narratives, to be in spaces where caste is being discussed. So I think Dalit women's standpoint and an isolation, I think it's not going to just work. It has to be a collaborative effort between those who have power and those who don't, if they really want to actually implement the agendas that they have, that is of power redistribution within communities as per your gender location and as per your caste locations.
Thank you so much for that. Like you said, this standpoint is important for us so we can understand like not every person's experience is the same. So there needs to be like this comprehensive understanding of unique experiences. But like, do Dalit women get to showcase this in real life? Because the space that they occupy in the reality of the literary world is like quite complex. Like, so, which brings me to my next question. Within the Dalit literature canon, how have Dalit female writers got space? Like, what is the reason for their current position, and what do you think needs change?
Within the Dalit literature, literary canon, I think Dalit literary canon in itself, like, is again a body of writing that has come after a lot of struggle, after a lot of like, after a lot of agitation. So it's already a marginalized, like, corpus, marginalized body of literature that has in itself is still gaining, is still struggling to gain legitimacy. It still doesn't have that much power to be like, to be precise. It's still like in that stage where like, Dalit men are getting like like Dalit men are relatively getting those opportunities. But then again, those opportunities have not really come that easy to them. It's not the onus of Dalit men to give space to like, people, to Dalit women, because who are they to give space? Dalit women, they are their own people. They will occupy their own space. But largely, like when gates are going to get opened for Dalit literature as a whole, more and more writings, more and more opportunities are going to get opened. And then within the movement, Dalit literary movement, then it will be like the responsibility of Dalit community as a whole to again practice the same practices that I'm talking about, power redistribution within the community, wherein you encourage Dalit women to speak on like for their own experience rather than speaking for them. Because as of now, like I have read a lot of like Dalit men's autobiographies as well, wherein they talk about their mothers in a very romantic way. Like kind of romantic. I understand that that comes from the need to like understand their experience and also talk about the contribution of mothers in their lives. But at the same time, I haven't read like in any Dalit man's writing about the individual personas of these women who they call as mothers and sisters. They're again like side characters. So I think that has largely been because also the larger structure that we live in is Brahminical, that transfers power from male first and then female. So as Dalit literature is going to gain legitimacy, like first the men are going to get power and then women are going to get power because again of the larger structure within which the Dalit literary movement is actually existing in. And if we want to change that, we will have to dismantle the larger structure and question it so that like the system of equal values starts like, and that's a very different system as opposed to Brahminical system, which again systematically gives you power based on where you are located in the caste hierarchy and then your gender location. So we have to change the larger structure for it to become like a structure that equally gives power to Dalit women and men and Dalit queer persons and persons with disabilities alike. Otherwise, it's going to be the same, that like what we see outside, what the structure is outside, and what is like the structure that is a norm that is created by again people who are caste privileged and who have been sustaining that system for a very long time. For example, I see a lot of feminist like priests now, and I get really confused that is this the agenda of like the feminist movement in India, that you have to become a priestess, and like how many Dalit women will actually get that opportunity? And by using again the same like festivals and things that reinforce the idea of patriarchy, because like I feel that just reproduces the same structure of Brahminism. And then we talk about Dalit literature and that like existing within the same Brahminical structure. I think it's going to follow the same structure of first power getting disseminated to a Dalit man and then to a Dalit woman. So if we have to change that, we will have to change the broader system. And then like we can probably talk about more equitable distribution of power, and wherein Dalit women can write about their own narratives just like Dalit men and just like a like caste privileged men and women.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of still historical marginalization and power dynamics at play here. Like you said, how so many of these male Dalit writers talk about their moms or their sisters, but they're not given like individual agency. So, which brings me to my next question. Can you share your insights on how Dalit female writers deconstruct and decentralize these overwhelmingly upper caste male accounts of historical retellings?
Yeah, here I would like to start by talking about masculinity. That operates very differently in the context of a marginalized man, say a Dalit man, and a caste privileged man. For in a lot of cases and a lot of like situations, that masculinity, like in the context of a Dalit man, is a coping mechanism, because if you are not going to adhere to those things, you're going to be killed. A lot of people get killed because they are sporting a mustache, which in my opinion is a very masculine like expression. So a lot of Dalit men are killed for like quote unquote showing that masculinity that is reserved for Dalit non-Dalit men. And also when rapes happen, like when sexual violence and any kind of violence that happens against a Dalit woman, like first of all we have to also understand, I mean I'm not trying to compare the rapes of like women, that's a very, like, I mean, I'm not trying to compare it, but at the same time, I'm trying to highlight how in the case of Dalit women, these kind of violence are not just individual violence, like individual cases of violence. In the case of Dalit women, like that violence gets perceived first in the form of animosity, in the form of any kind of grudge or anger against the entire community, not just that one person. That woman is not an object of lust for the other person. It's like the body of a Dalit woman is going to be like a site of war, against site of violence against the entire community, like, and which sort of teaches the entire community a lesson. It's never an act of lust. So what I'm trying to talk about here is about how, like, the idea of masculinity and the idea of violence, sexual violence and gender, it operates so, like, in a very different way than that of a and then that of a caste privileged person. So when, and given all of this context, when we talk about the writings of Dalit women and them trying to write about their experiences in a space where a lot of caste privileged men are writing about them. And I have read, I think you are Ananthamurthy's Samskara. This text I read during my master's, and there's this character called Bailey. It's a, like, sex worker from a Dalit community, and I have seen, like, I have read the descriptions, how, like, sexualized, sexually charged those descriptions are, and how, like, you would talk about the waist of a woman as if, like, you know, the body of a woman is just like for the gaze and sexual pleasure of that individual, of a caste privileged individual. So given all of this, it's like, it's problematic in multiple ways, because a body that you otherwise see as an untouchable, but when it comes to sexual gratification, you suddenly, like, it becomes an object of lust. So it just makes, like, me very confused and very, very, like, disgusted at the same time, that how are we, like how conveniently are we, like, switching between these two positions, and the agenda of which is just to assert power over a Dalit woman's body. So given this, when Dalit women write, when Dalit women, like, uh, choose to use their body to assert themselves, assert their identities, assert their experiences in the form of writing, in the form of any kind of art form, for that matter, it is doubly, like, it's a protest, like using your body how you want to use it, using your mind how you want to use it, writing your own experience, given the culture wants you to write a certain way, wants you to be a certain way, wants you to look a certain way, wants you to be a certain way. Like when a Dalit woman, like, tries to write, when a woman tries to, like, pursue any kind of art form that is an expression of her own individuality, I think that's a protest, not just against, like, uh, the caste privileged man as such who is writing and sexualizing that body, but also the Brahminical structure as such. Because again, as a part of caste system, there are, like, occupations that have been imposed on Dalit communities of, like, prostitution, sex work, and a lot of demeaning work. I think I also read about Pablo Neruda's I think Pablo Neruda has written a text about violating an Izhava woman, which is again considered like a lower caste woman, and how he has spoken about her rape in a literary text. It's the rape of a Izhava woman who used to be a manual scavenger, who used to come and pick up this excreta. Like every morning he came for a visit, like, to India. So that's the kind of, like, I mean, I loved Pablo Neruda's writing before actually coming to know about this aspect of it. And, like, I have read the descriptions. Some of the descriptions talk about how that woman was still staring wide-eyed at him when all of this was happening. And it's a description of a rape. It's not like a description of a consensual, like, sexual act. It was a forced act, and it's evident through the description that is written. And from, like, a very caste privileged gaze, it just seems like Dalit women's bodies are just seen as meat, as, like, objects of sexual gratification. And even when they're writing about it, it's from a very sexual perspective. So I think it's like whenever Dalit women do answer back to these narratives in any form, that's like protest. I think Dalit women doing anything is kind of protest, trying to live a happy life, trying to like just be like, and that I'm going to make a choice. I'm not going to be like, so I'm not going to succumb to what quote unquote the circumstances of my life are trying to like give me. I'm going to make a choice. I think that in itself is protest. So it's a very complex question that you've asked, and I can go in different dimensions of it, but like what came to my mind, like what was there at the top of my head, I just told you. I hope I was able to answer your question, and like if you have more questions we can proceed with them.
Thank you for this answer. Actually, even I used to think Pablo Neruda is a great writer, but I never came across this kind of account. Okay, that was extremely disturbing.
Yeah, that was I understand that feeling. I was also very confused because I had read him in undergrad, and then to see this happening, and I was very confused how to like deal with this because I also liked him.
His poems we read in school, and so
Yeah,
that's extremely shocking. But thank you for answering that question. Moving on to the next question. According to you, why do autobiographical accounts seem to be a prevalent choice for many Dalit female writers, like other than poetry and ethnographic research? Why just autobiographical accounts? Why are they more popular in a sense?
I think autobiographical accounts, why are they important? Yeah, that's one question that I'm also trying to explore, like for me, because again, most of the texts that I come across are either autobiographies or either autobiographical accounts. And like my limited understanding of this, because again, this is also a very big question. It's also because to legitimize the experience of I am, like I and we, like the erasure of the community as a whole, the erasure of that individual as a whole. So when like when you are in a crowd, when you are like asked to mix up within the crowd, when like you are erased from that space, that idea of registering your I, your we, I and we, it becomes extremely important expression that I am here, that I am also here. So like I think when Dalit men and women and like queer authors from the community, when they write, they're not writing from the perspective of glorifying their I. They're writing to like register that there is an I that is separate from like other I and we's, that is like that we are trying to talk about, that we are also here. This is why, like, because again the Dalit movement is in its nascent stages of gaining legitimacy. This is why we see a lot of first person writings, that we are also a part of like being an Indian, we are also the Indian experience, and we are also going trying to like question the ideas that have been imposed about us. So a very common example of this like this registering one's I, one's we, is also like in the form of fiction. Like I came across that very recently, I think 4 years ago. I started my research with that book. It's Munshi Premchand wrote a short story called Kafan, and wherein he talks about two characters, Madhav and Ghisu, who are Dalit characters, and again who are shown as sedulous, lazy people who just don't want to work, and because of whom their wife passes, like Madhav's wife passes away in pregnancy, because they were just shown so like unconcerned with things, people who like are struggling to gain work and don't even want to work. This is how the depiction is in that text. And like a kind of questioning of that is presented by Professor Ajay Navaria. He is an author and an associate professor of Hindi at Jamia Millia Islamia. He has written like a book, Hello Prem. He has written a short story called Hello Premchand, which has recently which got translated in English in 2013. The entire collection is called The Unclaimed Terrain, which is about caste in urban spaces. Caste, how does caste operate once you like gain one generation of people gain access to education? How do they struggle to gain legitimacy within like quote unquote middle class, and within the urban spaces, and like after migration, what happens. So one of the stories also called Hello Premchand, which is again questioning of what Munshi Premchand wrote in Kafan. So similarly, like that text is not written in a first person narrative. That's a fictional account. But at the same time, if you look at that entire collection as a whole, you will find like there's another story called like a new custom, wherein it's a story about a professor. So I couldn't help but notice the similarities between Professor Navaria and like what Professor Navaria was also talking about. So how fiction kind of gives you that distance to talk about certain things, because otherwise it becomes really uncomfortable and a really like a traumatic experience to write about it in first person like narrative. And another reason why like a lot of people try to write in first person is also because what they are writing is the truth, the version that they want to believe in, and not the imposed version of who they are, which is imposed by the society at large. Throughout your entire life, you are living with this idea that, you know, you are an untouchable, you don't belong here, you are not intelligent enough, you can't do this, you can't do that, you belong to this like strata of society. And these are the things, I can't touch you, like your shadow is going to pollute me. But at the same time, amid all of these voices, then the author picks up a pen, write a first person narrative about it, and questions that all those ideas and creates his own narrative, which is like a first person narrative. A lot of people are like doing this to claim that humanity is first. If you look at like all the authors who have written their autobiographies, the first text that they have written is going to be like, you know, an autobiographical piece or an autobiography. After that, they will start writing about their stories. And this has been my personal experience as well. I remember how talking about it in first person makes me very, very anxious, makes me very like I struggle to find words for that because I did not have the vocabulary. So when a lot of people who are writing about their autobiographies throughout years, they are trying to accumulate the vocabulary to articulate it. This is also why, like when a Dalit woman is writing, the language is very different from that of a caste privileged person. When we talk about how Dalit women write differently, this is the difference, because the vocabulary they have developed it on their own. It is shaped by their experiences of untouchability, which the larger society does not give them. The language for untouchability is not there in the society. It has to come from your own experiences. And then like you question the narrative about what people tell you who you are by reclaiming that narrative and reframing your reality, like by writing a first person narrative. That's like a very nuanced. I think I'm still in the process of trying to answer that question for myself. But as of now, this is what my understanding is, that first you will have to like question the narrative that is out there for you, and you do that by creating a self through these autobiographies, that this is who I am. And that happens through like, this is who I am and this is what my community is. My community is not of people who are dirty, who are not intelligent, who are like this, who are like that, all the popular ideas that are there in the mainstream imagination. The first person narratives are a reclamation of self, of humanizing oneself first. This is why you will see a lot of writers writing autobiographies.
Thank you. Actually, I also like you're talking about the I. So in a lot of Suki Dharani's work, she also talks about why she uses so much I in her work, because it's not about, there was some comment about how she said it's not about stroking one's ego, but about like this is her story that she needs to tell, and it like challenges so many prejudices that have been put forward for her community. So she needs to get that out there. She's not just representing herself, she's representing so many people. And it's a true account. It's what actually happens and not just something that's been set up and just been like a prejudice that's been put on them. So I think that is interesting. But like you had also mentioned how Dalit women face like not even triple marginalization, but multiple sense of marginalization. So they're aware of their exclusion that they face at caste levels, class, and gender. So how does this multifold hegemony faced by Dalit women pervade itself into the literary landscape?
Literary landscape doesn't exist in isolation. It also exists within, like, the Brahminical structure that is at large. Any kind of movement. And so, like, it's so if you have to imagine it visually, you can imagine it like a big circle. The Dalit movement exists within the same. The feminist movement exists within the same. The publishing houses exist within the same. The institutions exist within the same. The structures exist within the same. It's like white supremacy that we, like, if I have to draw parallels, it's like a kind of an internal colonization. Like, I think T.M. Yesudasan uses this term, internal colonization, wherein you are acquiring resources from, like, within, like, from like a community that is born, that is from the same country, and like making them feel that there is something wrong with them, that they are untouchables, they are unseeables. And like, so when you look at the bigger circle wherein all these structures are already existing within that, so it becomes very, very uh, difficult and complex to break that hegemony, although Dalit feminists are actually trying to do that. So Saujanya Tamal Pakula, she has written about this in her dissertation about how why Dalit movement, like why Dalit men, like, struggled to give, like, why could they not, like, why the Dalit movement also has the same concerns that the larger society at large has in terms of gender. So she argues that the bigger structure that all of us exist in is Brahminical. So whatever we are going to do is we are going to mimic that structure everywhere. You see, like, cinema, I can tell you about fashion industry, the same ideas. I can also tell you about academia, same ideas, same structures, same, like, ideas of merit, inherent talent, and whatnot. All of this is like intrinsically a part of, like, all these spaces that exist within that structure. So given all of this, I think it's very difficult to break that quote unquote multiple hegemony. And like Dalit women are trying, and they're seeking a lot of support from international movements, from anti-race movements that do give Dalit women a language, and vice versa. We are seeing that Isabel Wilkerson has come up with a book, on caste, and wherein she conceptualizes the race, conceptualizes race in the United States through caste, which is happening for the first time. And there is also a movie by Ava DuVernay that is coming, like, its name is Origins, and it's getting released on 8th December. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Like you said, there is still a need for more representation, and that it does not exist in isolation. So we were talking about, like, we've established there are a lot of complexities inherent in Dalit writings. So this brings me to my final question. How does a translator's identity impact the interpretation and presentation of Dalit female writing? Essentially, like, what are the key differences between Dalit translators and non-Dalit translators in this context?
I think I would like to use the gender analogy here. When we talk about gender, there is this idea of male gaze. So I don't think, like, a male translator will be able to encapsulate a woman's experience when they're translating it. That's the same difference. Like when you talk about a Dalit writer and a non-Dalit translator. So a lot of times the vocabulary that a Dalit person is employing is a result of their experience. Because untouchability is a very unique, like, experience. It's like you won't find it anywhere in the world. Like there are no parallels to the idea of somebody, like somebody's touch being polluting. There are, like, ideas that are similar in nature, that, like, not even similar actually. The way I have understood all of this is that all structures of oppression results in a similar experience of alienation, isolation, making somebody feel that they are not human enough. But at the same time, these structures operate very differently in the sense, for example, somebody who is a survivor of a Vietnam War or like any kind of war, or like somebody is a person with disability, somebody is like a Dalit person, somebody like even womanhood. All these experiences create people into others. But at the same time, like the otherization is due to different reasons. So while there are possibilities of establishing a collective understanding of like marginalized experience, but at the same time, in the case of caste, in the case of Dalit women's experience, because caste struggles to gain legitimacy as a oppressive structure, like it will be very difficult for a translator who is a non-Dalit for them to actually translate a Dalit text. I'll give you an example. So for example, if a Dalit woman writer writes about like her experience of like going to a temple, or like an everyday experience of uh, like doing some kind of worship, or doing some kind of like being forced in some kind of a worship, like you have to uh, do like something that is very normalized in the structure otherwise. But then you are, for example, I took the example of feminist like woman priests. To a larger population, that seems as a very revolutionary idea. But for somebody who is a Dalit person, you see that layer of like untouchability in there, because among those Brahmin priests, there will never be like a Dalit woman priest over there. The like Dalit woman will like they will never be allowed to, like somebody who's not even allowed in a temple, how will they even see them in a position of priest? And even if it's going to be there, it's going to be very tokenistic. I remember like Navayana came out with this narrative of I'm forgetting the author's name, but about somebody who was a part of like a Hindu organization, and how he left that organization because of like otherization and experience of it. So like how their experience of being in that space was very different. That was not comprehensible for somebody who was not a Dalit, because it's not a part of like any mainstream conversation. When you don't have like any idea of what the person is actually talking about, the experience that the person is talking about, you don't find it in mainstream, you don't find any information from anywhere about it. And on the top of it, if you are yourself a caste privileged person, chances are that you have had that kind of training like from like childhood only. So for example, we are taught to pray, like we learn like things as a part of our everyday like routines as like as we grow up. So a lot of people, I spoke to a lot of my friends who are from caste privileged position. For them, keeping cups and plates separate for like domestic helps was a very common practice. So it doesn't occur to them that it's a caste practice, that it comes from the place of untouchability. So when a person is like writing about it, when like a Dalit person is going to write about something like that, it's not going to make sense to like somebody who has been conditioned to see that as normal. So these are subtle nuances that will take away from that narrative which is entrenched in a caste experience, an experience of untouchability, which is not comprehensible to a major degree, major like extent to a person who is from a caste privileged location. So, and especially is also a part of the structure as well. I'm like here specifically talking about a caste privileged translator. So like it's going to be very, very like again the gaze is going to be different. Like for like when a woman is writing and when a man has to translate that, like the gendered experience of it, it's going to get diluted because the man, their experience has been very different of living within the society. And for them, they will have to do extra labor, extra efforts to understand that experience as a whole and then translate it. So like untouchability and the experience of it might get lost when you try to like translate a text like that is by the Dalit writer. And also because like I think there's this debate, like I think this debate is long settled. I think there's this uh, like work by Sundar Sarukai and Gopal Guru wherein they discuss who should write Dalit literature. And the consensus is that like, the text should be written by a person from the community who's had a lived experience of it. And like research and like other things, anybody can do that, because caste is not just the problem of a Dalit person. Caste is a problem of the society at large. Because like I mean, when we talk about the constitution, the values of equality, liberty and fraternity, and like basically a just society as a whole, like then a structure like caste that creates artificial divide, it becomes a problem for everybody. It hinders people's joy, it hinders people's like experience of like, because we as human beings are social creatures, we like we live in communities, we have like historically lived in tribes and groups. So when you introduce artificial structures that take away from that experience of like mutual joy, of mutual empathy, of love, of seeing the other person, so it becomes a problem of the entire society as a whole. So I think in future, like once untouchability and caste become a topic that is discussed widely, then maybe it will be possible for like a non-Dalit writer to actually translate a text by a Dalit person. But till the time Dalit discourse as a whole struggles to gain legitimacy and is accepted, and that like caste has like untouchability as a source, and how like there are also issues about how caste also dictates your class location, in the sense caste ensure like caste in the past has ensured who is going to get education, who is going to get access to resources, and that the impact of it we see in today's like world, like who has access to resources, who's like has been having generational wealth and who doesn't. So it's very very different. Like these two lives are very different lives, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of conscious effort to like reach that space where like the experience of untouchability is can be empathized with. Right now, as I told you, there are just two narratives out there in popular culture, popular narratives, popular conversations. Either like people from quote unquote Dalit communities are like conmens, or are conmens opportunists who take reservation, who have it easy, and who like are somehow just making up the experiences of caste, or like or they are just victims. There is nothing in between. This is like the humanness of Dalits is negated for now. So once that becomes accepted, once that experience, so for example, even when we talk about queer communities, queer experiences, that again is gaining legitimacy in the popular discourse, that there is a problem. We have not even diagnosed the problem of caste in our society at this point. When we don't acknowledge that there is a problem, how will we even like find a solution to it? We have to like, so with other discourses, with disability, with queer communities, gender, like we have acknowledged that these are structures that produce certain experiences, that experiences of oppression. We have not yet like come at an understanding of that in terms of caste. We are like still like it's still going to take some time for it to be fully there. I mean, on Instagram, on Facebook, on like some niche areas, it appears that there are a lot of caste conversations happening, but you come back to the same society and you realize it's just the same. You see people use caste slurs, you see people like do caste practices. It's just the same. It's all of this is happening in like caste, like in like very limited spaces, and it's like research practice gap. Once something gets researched on, it takes at least 20 to 50 years for it to get implemented. So it's the same. Right now we are just starting to do that research. I don't know like how many more years it is going to take for people to actually acknowledge it and then like do it and like practice it in like their lives. Like till now I think the government incentivizes like marrying into like marrying a person of like other from Dalit communities. They pay people money. Do you see how people have to incentivize this, that intercaste marriages are not happening? Rajasthan government pays you money, I think 10 lakh rupees, if you marry a person who is a Dalit person. It's like that difficult. And then honor killings, people literally get killed. So I think we are far away from that, like, but I think there will be a time where we will arrive at that space where people are able to like translate Dalit narratives. First, like for that, the first step is to empathize with that, to acknowledge that experience. I think once that happens, it will happen. But right now, we are far away from that. So it's very difficult for somebody like who doesn't have the vocabulary of like caste, who doesn't have the vocabulary of untouchability, for them to translate a Dalit narrative. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like we see a lot of conversations happening online, but when we talk to people, there's still that same practice, the same language that's been used still. And I think in the case of non-Dalit translators, a lot can get lost in translation. I would like to shift a bit from a literature perspective. Just one. Do you think in like cinema, if it's a story about say a Dalit person, so do you think that role should be played only by a Dalit actor, because someone else might not be able to portray the same sort of emotion? Like you said, there's a need to empathize with that. So in that sense, what do you think?
I agree. I agree with that. And in fact, that is what I have been trying to say, that give these spaces, this, like, since you mentioned, like, how do you redistribute this? How do you make, like, people come forward? This is how you do it. Make people a part of your projects, give them the rightful places to play roles. For example, Ava DuVernay, like her movie Origin, in that, the person who is playing the character of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar is from the community, is a professor from the community. And something like that has not happened in the Indian cinema at all. They will tell the story like, but then we'll also have to like keep this in mind, the economics of it. Who is benefiting from these stories? When somebody like I think, I don't know who made in Heaven, Zoya Akhtar, I guess. So who is largely like, what production house is actually getting the benefit of that story? The capital of it. So there is no redistribution happening. The stories are not just happening for like, there are like these places are not NGOs. So there is money being made, and who is getting benefited out of these? So when you hire a Dalit actor to play a character, you make them a part of the process. You also aid in redistribution of wealth, accurate representation. And it's not a very difficult task, I think. Because again, like imagine, like I have recently been to Australia for like some work, and I got to know about like, the Aboriginals and like how they use like the people of Australia, like they use certain practices every time they would have to open a like, function or any kind of a conference or anything. They thank people of like, Aboriginal origins, but you wouldn't find them in the room. So I was like, I'm very confused with this. You would thank them like you literally colonized the space. You took their land away and you have not given them voting rights. You thank them, but then you don't find them in the room. It's like, otherwise, if you don't ensure representation and redistribution of wealth, it's very tokenistic in nature, that you're just doing this, but like, what is your intention with it? So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to know what you thought about the cinematic experience in that sense. And
Yeah.
that's all I have for today. This has been an extremely insightful conversation. Thank you so much for working with us. And if you'd like to leave any concluding comments, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I also had one more thing about cinema. So again, when we talk about cinema and actors and quote unquote, again, the idea of merit comes in. Who is a good actor? Who is not a good actor? But I think those resources can be provided to anybody. And it's not about quote unquote inherent talent. Certain people have had generational access to resources, which is why they could take up an occupation such as acting, which is very uncertain. and like which requires you to be from a certain background, which requires certain kind of grooming, certain kind of resources. A lot goes in like being like in an industry that is very much heavily dependent on your appearance. So I think when you talk about like acting as quote unquote an inherent talent, it's not inherent talent, it's a set of skills that has been inculcated over years. So we can't say that, you know, we gave that so and so person a role because they're good actors. You can find like the character that is being played by Professor Gaurav J. Pathania. He's literally an academic. He's not an actor. This is the first time he is like playing a role in a film. So they have also made those attempts, and like how important it is to like cast people in roles that they are like the communities that they're coming from. So the idea of brown face and black face, like I mean, I think like today we know that it's very, very problematic. And in Shakespeare's time, I think in during Renaissance period, when women were not like it was not seen as a good woman behavior to like, one second, I'm so sorry, I think my Teams was opening up, sorry. So during Renaissance, when men were like playing the role of women, and similarly like in the racist context, like white people playing the role of like black people by painting their faces and by using caricaturish voices and things, that's extremely problematic. And the same is happening in the case of caste, but it's also very complex in the case of caste, because caste is not a racially driven structure. It's conceived at birth, and like we have established anthropologically that India is heterogeneous in terms of like, I mean, India has no racial differentiation between people. All of us have similar, like we all of us are the same in terms of race. So there is no racial differentiation, and artificial differentiations are being created to establish and propel that propaganda, that idea that, you know, somehow Dalits are different. So like again, coming back to the idea of acting as like a skill, I think it can be given to anybody. Like if you really want to like redistribute things and provide an accurate representation, then you will have to find out people who will like, you know, who would be eager to enter these spaces, because these are again spaces that operate heavily on like connections. We do have debates about nepotism in the context of Sushant Singh Rajput dying and other actors finding it hard who are like first generation actors. But then nobody talks about how it's also a very caste driven thing. When you talk about nepotism, when you give roles to people from your own families, there is also like a caste element to it. These people are again like from upper caste lobbies. If we care, like if you find their caste like backgrounds, you will find they're all like from similar caste backgrounds. And it's not like how difficult it is to permeate through those lobbies when you don't have any caste connections, when you don't come from a caste privileged background, there are no caste connections, and then you don't even have resources. So you will have to take an extra step if you are in a position of power to bring people who are not in power into the center stage and give them their own stage that is due to them, not as a charity but as parity. So that's the last comment that I wanted to make.
Thank you for that. I do agree that it's a very heterogeneous in terms of caste in Bollywood, and you barely see any person from the Dalit community or any other community. So yeah, thank you so much. This is all I have for today. And I really do hope we get to collaborate again. We might, because this is just the first issue and we have 2 more issues to go. So
yeah, I'll be really happy to do that. Like
yeah.
I had fun talking about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed like whatever, like you've told me a lot about so many like movies, for instance, and Pablo Neruda. That's something I'm never forgetting. So thank you. This has been really insightful.